After the Civil War, America, of course, entered the Reconstruction era, which has been portrayed at times as a sort of low point in the history of American democracy. But historian Eric Foner disputes this belief as fake history created by the Jim Crow South, which is meant to obscure gains which were made by African Americans during that time. DeWitt Clinton Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University, Eric Foner, joins us now to explain how Reconstruction applies to today's political landscape. And it's great to have you, Professor.
Hello, nice to talk to you.
Absolutely. So could you just set up some of that context for us to start with? How was Reconstruction portrayed throughout history, and what was the reality?
Well, for many, many years, decades, this is what I learned in high school, many other people, Reconstruction, as you said, was portrayed as kind of the lowest point in the history of American democracy. The argument was that black people, black men who received the right to vote during Reconstruction, really for the first time in American history, were just incapable of being part of American democracy. And the result was corruption, misgovernment, and eventually the more patriotic elements in the South, the Ku Klux Klan, supposedly, and groups like that, restored good government, which really meant white supremacy in the southern states. The relevance of this, I think, inaccurate view of Reconstruction is that it was really part of the justification for the Jim Crow South. That is, it was a justification for taking the right to vote away from black Americans. They'd had the right to vote, and look what happened. If they got the right to vote back, you'd have more of the horrors of Reconstruction, supposedly. But I think today, most historians see Reconstruction as a positive era. It was an important turning point in American democracy. The Constitution was rewritten to create equality before the law for all Americans, regardless of race, something that had never existed in the United States before. And, the civil rights era was sometimes called the Second Reconstruction. And the agenda of Reconstruction, of equality, of voting rights, of citizenship rights, that's still on our agenda today. It's still being fought over. These issues from 150 years ago: who should have the right to vote? Who can be a citizen? How do you deal with terrorism like the Klan and other groups? That's still part of our politics today. So what we think about Reconstruction actually matters more than just an academic historical argument.
Yeah, I think that is so well said. And so explain how that history was misconstrued and misinterpreted in a way to preserve white supremacy for so many decades after the fact.
Yeah, well, sad to say, among scholars, this view originated at my university, Columbia University, with this around 1900 or so, with William Dunning and his students, the so-called Dunning School. And as I said, the core of their argument was what was called at that time the white man's burden. That is, that white people had an obligation to rule over non-whites, just as was happening in Africa and in Asia, also in the American South. And that the big mistake of Reconstruction was giving equal rights as citizens to black Americans. And that was exactly the moment when Jim Crow, as we call it, was being fastened upon the South, where the right to vote was being taken away, where lynching was becoming, very prominent, where the educational system for blacks was being completely undermined. And so this was part of the justification of the Jim Crow South. That's something that, as a historian, I have to admit that my profession played a very disreputable role in using history to promote white supremacy a century and a little more than that ago.
And you've talked about how this is relevant to voting rights, to citizenship rights, even to things like how we deal with acts of domestic terror. What about the understanding of economic rights? How was that thought of and tried to be executed on at the time?
Well, that's a great question because, most people don't know much about Reconstruction, but many of them have heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule, which was the demand of former slaves, 4 million former slaves, for some kind of economic wherewithal, land in an agricultural society, which is critical, to give an economic foundation to the freedom they had acquired as a result of the Civil War. That didn't happen. You might say in Reconstruction there was a political revolution, a democratic revolution, but not an economic revolution. Blacks did not get land. They remained poor. dependent upon white employers. And in a certain sense, the same type of thing happened a century or so later during the civil rights era, that the progress on public accommodations, on voting, on housing was much deeper than than combating economic inequality. And today, of course, we're finally maybe trying to come to grips with that. What is the relationship between political democracy and economic democracy? That's a Reconstruction question that's still on our political agenda right now.
Well, and this is one of the things that fascinated me about your book, because I hadn't thought deeply about this idea of you have an economy that's basically decimated in the South, and you have a newly freed group of people, and there's a whole question of, okay, how do we organize economically? How do these people fit into that regime? What does it look like? What were some of the competing philosophies? What were some of the competing experiments that were engaged in at the time?
Well, as I said, for African Americans, the answer was pretty clear. We want land, they said. Give us land and our freedom will be secure. We'll be able to build communities without being completely dependent upon white Southerners. White Southerners had a completely different view of this transition that you referred to. They thought, yeah, of course, slavery is over. They understood that. But that blacks should just go back to work on the plantations just as they had before. Okay, now they're going to be paid a little bit, unlike under slavery, but they should stay out of civil rights, out of political rights, and that actually the economy wouldn't look all that different from what it was under slavery. You'd have white people owning the land, you'd have black people working the land, growing cotton, etc. But that was not what African Americans thought freedom meant, and it wasn't what the North thought freedom meant. And in the North, which was victorious and was setting out these parameters, their ideal was what they called free labor. That is, that people should have the right to compete in the labor market, to move from job to job if they wanted to. They couldn't be forced to go to work on a plantation the way Southern whites wanted. But in the economic, as you said, devastation of the South, and with racism so deeply entrenched in a slave society, the free labor market didn't really function very effectively. Black people who acquired land sometimes found themselves assaulted by the Ku Klux Klan, their house burned, they're maybe assassinated. In other words, getting ahead was not just an economic question, it was that you needed to have terrorism kept under control so that people could enjoy the progress they made. So it was a very difficult situation. As I say, a society that for 250 years had been based on slavery now had to reposition itself as a free society. And it took a long time for the shape of that new society to become clear. The problem is, by the time it became clear that the political rights of African Americans were being stripped away, so they couldn't really utilize the labor competition to improve their condition in life.
And before Lincoln was assassinated, what was his view and what was his role in this debate?
Well, Lincoln was trying to win the Civil War. He didn't actually lay out a blueprint for Reconstruction. Lincoln had this great, capacity to let different things go on at the same time. So in some areas, the government said, okay, black people have to sign contracts to go back to labor on the plantations. But, in early 1865, General William T. Sherman issued an order setting aside a whole bunch of land in South Carolina and Georgia for the settlement of black families in 40 acres. This is the origin of 40 acres and a mule, Sherman's order. Lincoln let that go forward. He didn't endorse it. He didn't criticize it or revoke it. He said, let's see what happens when black people get small farms of their own. So Lincoln didn't have a plan. He was always trying to figure out what worked. And different things were tried in different parts of the South. But unfortunately, his successor, who came in after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson, who was deeply racist and had really, I think, a claim to being the worst president in American history. But there are some other competitors nowadays, but Johnson's a candidate anyway. But Johnson just returned all this land to the owners. He told black people, you're not eligible to vote, you're not eligible to have citizenship rights, just go back to work as if you were slaves. So it took a long time to fight out the parameters of economic change in the South. And into the 20th century, you know, FDR in the New Deal said the South is the #1 economic problem in the country. That's 70 years after the Civil War. And African Americans being at the bottom of the ladder in the most problematic economic area, they suffered the most from the economic stagnation of the South.
Right, and then in many ways written out of the New Deal and not included in many of those programs. I want you to expand on something that you said, which I think is really important, which you tied it to the civil rights era. And of course, the project that Martin Luther King was working on when he was assassinated was this project of securing economic rights with the Poor People's Campaign, which was meant to be a multiracial, anti-poverty sort of economic rights campaign. And you made the comment that perhaps today we're finally working on making real progress on securing those economic rights. I have to confess, I don't always see that progress really clearly in front of me right now, so I just wondered if you could expand on what you meant by that.
Well, I mean, I think what's been going on this summer in this country, in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd and other African Americans, has led to the, you know, demands for all sorts of change dealing with what is now called systemic racism. What we now understand is that the black condition is not just one thing. It's not, okay, they need the right to vote. Okay, they need public accommodation access or access to good schools. All these things are interrelated with each other. Access to housing. They're all connected. And those issues are now to the forefront in the streets every day. Black Lives Matter doesn't have a, you know, total economic agenda, but it does make the point that, you know, that these economic inequalities are still with us and need to be addressed. Nothing is going to happen until after the election, I'm sure. And depending on who wins the election, the government may or may not be, you know, in a position or to desire to actually address deep economic inequalities in this country. But, you know, you can just throw around statistics. The average black family has assets, that is a house, a car, a bank account, which is only 1/10 the assets of the average white family. In other words, they have almost nothing. They have nothing to fall back on. Even middle-class people, if they lose their job, are down in poverty in a month or two. That's the legacy of history. Family assets are what is built up over time. It's not like income from a job, which comes in every week or every month. And, you know, our society has never allowed African Americans to accumulate money and assets the way white families have. And so history is still with us. I mean, as a historian, I have to make that point, you know, that we are still living with the consequences of the long, long history of slavery and Jim Crow in this country.
Yeah, Professor, I think that is so important and so well said. I've been reading your book. It's been incredibly helpful, incredibly eye-opening, and so has your segment this morning. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And we'll have more Rising for you after this.